Hey, it's great to have our Georgia contingent finally join us this morning.
We were working.
Yes, we were.
So, for those of you that don't know, my name is Chris Forsland. I'm a senior implementation consultant with Sustain. I've been with the company for 14 years now. I currently live in Atlanta, Georgia. And prior to that, I was a deputy sheriff in Northern California for 17 years. So, been working with Sustain products for 16, 17 years total now, starting with the DOS program, like Keith talked about in the class earlier, and the Justice Edition, and now finally in Workflow. And so, this is a workflow workshop. What we're going to do today, and the objectives of this are, hopefully, we're going to try to get an understanding of workflow basics. We want to understand workflow development and the concepts behind workflow development. Identify and discuss a problem area that can be solved within workflow. Step through a workflow from beginning to end. I know there's been a lot of questions. Yesterday they had the class with business rules and how workflow. Now hopefully today we can kind of put that together for you from beginning to end. We're going to take a workflow from the very beginning all the way to the end and step through it and show you how it's configured and show you what eCourt can do for you. So the first question is, why workflow? Right? So workflow allows you to explicitly and declaratively model control of an application, right, in technical terms. So correctly automated workflow within an application greatly increases efficiencies and reduces risks. Right? The configuration that I'm going to show you today is an example. There's, I don't know, what do you have, Carla, 100 workflows in there probably?
At least.
Yeah, so lots of automated processes, and now because of that, they're able to do a lot more things with a great reduced amount of staff. So with workflow, rather than embedding that application logic within code in the application, a properly developed workflow engine will allow you to configure that on the fly, because obviously things change. You implement a product and things change during the life of that case management system, or in the life of a court. You have legislative changes, you have new ideas, you have new processes. You want to be able to do those things without having to go back to development and recode that. So, and as a result, as part of that, as you're building the workflow, you should be able to inspect that logic, visualize it, and track your execution from beginning to end. And even change the logic at runtime. And so eCourt provides a highly configurable, powerful workflow component that allows you to figure out that before active development. So configurable workflow, it puts the workflow development in the hands of non-developers. Right? That's kind of key. So we don't have to go back to development if you need, if you're changing a process, you need a new notice that's automatically generated in the system. You shouldn't have to go back to development and say, I need this done. It allows you to make changes on the fly without going back to development. Allows for changes as the court changes and as your process changes. So let's talk briefly, and I'm going to blow through these slides and then we're going to really get into the meat of this, but when you're developing workflow, first of all, you have to determine the problem that's to be solved. Right? And one of the examples that we have when we went live with the Gwinnett Recorder's Court a year ago, they had these processes where they went to warrant, and at the same time they issued the warrants on the case, they ended up sending a notice out to the defendant, right? But the warrant would have already been issued. So we determined that that's actually kind of a problem area, because what's the purpose, right? In a traffic ticket, it doesn't really do any good to issue warrants on those cases. It just doesn't, because they're probably going to sit there and rot, and you never see that person again, right? So the idea is to get them to pay their traffic tickets. So simply, we just went through the process and said, you know what? It would be better for us, or better for them, to send out a postcard, a warning postcard, when they fail to appear. And when, just by generating that postcard and sending it out pre-warrant, their revenues skyrocketed. It was pretty crazy. I don't know, Carly, how many,
I think our issuance of warrants probably went down 30, 40%.
30, 40%. And so now
On
people are
those
finally
ones.
paying the traffic tickets, right? So that was an example of a problem that needed to be solved. We solved it utilizing workflow. One of the keys to that is to utilize the appropriate documentation tools. Tools we like to develop workflow in Visio. I love a program called Lucidchart, which is available, that I subscribe to on the internet, that's available anywhere. And I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. There's other freeware third-party tools such as Workflow Designer and those kind of things out there. So the idea is you want to visualize your workflow, put it together, and then develop your workflow off of that. So you're documenting your process, configuring your workflow, testing your workflow, of course, and then finally implementing your workflow and putting it into production. So when we get into eCourt workflow, the workflow engine consists of two main elements. Right? One that automatically gathers the appropriate cases for some of the work queues. The gathering is triggered by activity within the CMS. So the idea is that you always have a triggering event which kicks off workflow. And that could be the add of a record, that could be an update of a record, any record in the system. That could be, it could be a file trigger. So if you have a file directory that's sitting out there that's being monitored, the input of that can trigger workflow as well. So the workflow sits out there and listens and waits for certain things to happen. And then the other element is the actual work queue where a task is completed and actions are selected. So within eCourt, we have several different types of workflows. We have automatic workflows, which trigger business rules in the system. We have manual workflows, which are assignments. So if something triggers and a user needs to take a look at that workflow, we call that a manual workflow. The other one is we call a router queue. So a router queue is basically an if-then statement. So if you get a triggering event and it needs to look at something, if this, do this, if this, do this, if this, do this. We call that a router queue. So, and we'll get into this here in just a second, but to organize workflow, the administrator creates process groups, names within each of these. The process names and then the work queues within each process. And then we go through and define the business process. And so I'll show you an example of that and what that looks like. So here's an example in our workflow setup. So this workflow that we're going to walk through today is failure to appear with a cache bond. So when we talk about process groups, this group up here is the failure to appear with a cache bond, and we have the triggering event, which is the first event up here. And so what this says is this is a scheduled event update with a result type of a failure to appear with a cache bond. So there's a condition behind this. And then it goes through and just goes through the process. And so with that, we talked about tools earlier. Here's this Lucidchart. And so in our baseline eCourt configuration, we have 22 defined processes that are sitting out there that we have documented. And this is an example of how I documented these particular workflows. So when we go through this today, you'll see that the first triggering event here is a defendant fails to appear. And so what happens with that? When the defendant fails to appear, we have a pay or appear time standard that sits out there. And that time standard, if the defendant appears in court and pays the fine, that time standard goes away. If it doesn't, that time standard ultimately expires automatically. The next thing that happens is we update the scheduled event result with a failure to appear. That actually then triggers a warrant. Because this has a cache bond in it, their process is we're going to go to the warrant process, right? So here, you can either put them into a failure to appear grace period over here, this 21-day grace period, or we can go ahead and generate a warrant on that. Right? And so this is an example right here of a manual queue, right? So we go through this failure to appear process, it'll show up in somebody's task list that says, hey, do we need to generate a warrant? Or do we need to put them into a failure to appear grace period? And so when we go ahead and say, yes, generate the warrant, we go down here, we generate the warrant with a pending status, we generate the warrant document, and then it sends it to a warrant print queue, and then it ultimately sends it to an approval queue, right? And then go down here and we can approve approve the warrant. And if we approve the warrant, then it adds an automatic $100 bench warrant fee. It adds a bail forfeiture awaiting transfer 90-day time standard at forfeited, not as disposition, and then updates the bail status to inactive. And then we add the bail forfeiture order. They can also in here choose through these results to forfeit the case as a disposition. So if they were to forfeit it as a disposition because we have cash bail on the case, it'll update the charges with the bail forfeiture, generate an invoice, add the sentence records, and add a case disposition automatically, and then sends it to another queue that says, hey, there's been a cash bond on this case, it's a forfeiture, and the money needs to be transferred. Right? So here's an example of a workflow, again, that's documented from beginning to end. So I want to go through your processes and document it in this format. And then I'm going to show you how that actually works in eCourt before we get into the slide of that. Let's see. Okay.
Chris, could you zoom in one up?
What's that?
It is blurry in eCourt. Your other slides are blurry. Could you just maybe zoom in on the one square? Just to, I just want to just wait.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better? Yeah. All right, so I have a case here in eCourt. And so this is a mandatory appearance case. And you can see here that because there was an arrest made in this case, we have a time standard that sits out there that's waiting for bond information. All right, this assumes that in this environment that this defendant was in jail, they're either going to be in jail or, you know, if they're not in jail, then they're either released on an Aurora bond or they were released on a surety bond or a cash bond. So here's this time standard that sits out there. If the court hasn't received the bond information within 14 days, then this is going to pop a queue that says, hey, you need to talk to jail. Why haven't we received this bonding information? So I'm going to go ahead and take a cash bond on this case real quick. And when I do that, $25. The fact that I'm going to put the cash bond on this case and take the payment, when there's a failure to appear on this, it puts it into a completely different bucket. I just save the payment, and now I have $425 sitting out here in cash bail trust. And if I go back to the case summary, you see that that awaiting payment time standard disappeared. So we have a mandatory appearance case. Now there's a cash bond on this, right? So this time standard, this mandatory appearance, coincides with the scheduled event arraignment on this case, which is also the 22nd. And so this time standard sits out there and it just waits and it just listens. If the case is ultimately disposed, this time standard goes away. If nothing happens on this case, then this time standard will automatically expire. As Donna showed in her overview yesterday, the status on this will change from active to expired automatically. And when we do this, right, that met the guidelines of our first triggering event. Remember, it was well, the original triggering event was the time standard expiration, but what it is this update of a scheduled event with a failure to appear. So workflow automatically put in this failure to appear and then triggered a workflow process. And this is this process that shows up here. It's available at the case level. It's also available, of course, on the assignments. So when users come in and log into the system, they see their actual assignments in the list here. So as soon as that loads up here, I'll show you. It gives you a list, and then you can look at it on a case level too. And so here's the actual task. This little icon here shows additional details behind this. So basically the instructions are, this is a failure to appear with a cash bond, review the case for an issuance of a warrant and a bond forfeiture. So here's an example of a workflow list. And that task is going to show up in this list, and you can work these cases. So here's failure to appear with a cash bond, and there's 180 of them right now. And so we're going to load those up. And when we load it up, the same things are available here. So we have our failure to appear with the cash bond, we have the instructions, and most importantly, we have the results. What's going to happen with this, right? What are your options? So here, like we said in that workflow diagram, you can generate a warrant, you can put them into failure to appear grace period, or you can actually disregard it. Here's these cases that I loaded up. So from here, again, I can open this. If I open this case, I can see it, it puts it in this view with this workflow. Or I can deal with these one at a time by selecting the results. So I can clear my queues right from working from the list here. Or I could stack them all and select the result. And if I wanted to generate a warrant on all these cases, I would just stack them up and then select generate, and it would go through and generate warrants on all these. Okay. For the purposes of this, what we're going to do is we'll just work within the confines of the case. So again, here's our instructions, here's our open task, and here's a result. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to generate a warrant in this case. Right. We decided that they didn't appear. When we generate the warrant, what it's going to do is it's going to go out and it automatically adds a warrant, puts it in pending status because it hasn't been approved yet. It actually adds a bench warrant document. So in the Gwinnett world, what it does is it generates a bench warrant with a barcode at the top. So these bench warrants get printed out, they go upstairs, the judge signs them, it comes back down, they put it in the scanner, they can put it in any scanner, push the button, it reads the barcode and attaches it to the right document on the case. So once this document is signed, they would just scan that back in and it would attach it to this bench warrant document right here. Sign. Also up here, I talked about the bail, cash bail, it shows that it's posted. So there's bail on this case, we have a bench warrant that hasn't been approved yet, and it's actually in pending status. So based on the fact that I generated that bench warrant, the next thing that it did was, remember it sent it to a queue to allow us to print this bench warrant document to a network printer. But most importantly, the next option in here is to activate a bench warrant, or we can forfeit the bail. So from here, if I activate the warrant, remember it's going to go through and it's going to generate the bench warrant fee. If I forfeit the bail as a disposition, what it'll do is it'll go through and update the case, update the charges, and then create the invoice on the case to be paid. All right. For the purposes of this, we'll go ahead and activate the warrant. So when I activate the warrant, what it does is it automatically adds a $100 bench warrant fee. It puts the warrant flag up here in the header screen. And then you can see here now that the warrant has been activated, it's red. So the warrant's been activated. So there we go. The other thing that it did was it added a waiting transfer to bail forfeiture, not a disposition. So in this case, their process is what this warrant has been issued, we're going to forfeit the bail, not as disposition. What we mean by that, we're just going to take the bail. So what happens is, one of the problems that they ran into was the judges would go ahead and forfeit the bail on a case, and the money would be transferred to the general fund. And then the defendant comes back in and says, deals with the judge, and the judge says, okay, you know what, you can have your bond money back. But the bond money's already been distributed, right? So what we did is we put in a 90-day time standard that sits out there and waits, right? And at the end of 90 days, what happens is this expires. And when this expires, it should have, but it didn't do it, generated a new invoice actually to transfer. It actually didn't do it. But it would generate a $425 invoice that you can then go ahead and transfer the money. So here in this case, as an example, we went through that from beginning to end, right? And so let's talk about how this actually looks in eCourt. So again, here is the pay or appear time standard that expired, and then we updated the scheduled event with a failure to appear, and then we go to the generate the warrant. So if we go to system setup, we go to business processes, and we go to workflow. We go to the core process group. We can go into here and select actually failure to appear with a cash bond. So here's the first event. This is the workflow group, and these are all the workflows. So the first one that we're going to hit here is going to be a manual queue, but here's the trigger. So here's the audit log. So here for the message type, it's an event. We're looking at the event entity, and for here you can look, you get any system we can listen to and look at the fire workflow. Right? So here's a scheduled event. We're actually doing an update of that scheduled event, and we're looking at the result type field. Right? And here's our condition. So we can pick a condition from here, and then we can actually look at the condition and what that looks like. So in eCourt, we have a condition builder that allows you to build and modify conditions. So here we have, we're looking at this condition that's a scheduled event. If my scheduled event result type is a failure to appear, and my scheduled event type, bail type is, my bail type is cash, and my bail record is active, and has a case jurisdiction with the recorder's court, then I want you to trigger this workflow. If I wanted to create a brand new condition, I can actually do that and call it whatever I wanted to call it. But then from here, you can actually start building your condition, right? So let's say we want to look at scheduled event, and then we want to look at a field in scheduled event. Like result reason. And then we have is blank, is like in, so let's just say is no current order. So you can start building conditions. So one of the keys in eCourt is that you really need to know how to build conditions if you're going to configure eCourt, because conditions are everywhere. They're in workflow, they're in financials, they're in forms, they're everywhere in the system. So the condition builder is really core to configuring the application. But anyways, we have this condition. So we have the event result, FTA cash bail. So here's our audit log. We can also do date triggers, as I said. We can also do timer triggers where it runs daily, weekly, monthly. We can run it every few minutes. We have interface. This is really good for interfaces when we want to pick up files or we want to run a process every few minutes. We can use a timer trigger. And we also use file triggers to monitor a certain directory. So if you have a process that drops a file into an FTP site or into a folder on a server, as soon as that file hits, it'll trigger the workflow to fire.
Is that done by UNC?
Yes. Yep. So here's our triggering event again. We name this actual process group failure to appear cash bond. We give it a number, whether it's valid from and to, so we can put an end date or an expiration date on this workflow if we want to, and we can activate it or inactivate it. But then our first actual workflow here, our work queue, is a manual queue. One of the important things to notice here is that this work queue type, it shows down here manual. We could actually change that if we wanted to. So we have automatic, manual, and router queues. But then we have sub-process calls, which I haven't really used. But here, again, it's whether it's active, but here we're looking at an actual manual queue. Right? So if I save and configure this, we name it, we can put in these instructions. I showed you that instructions and how they look for the user. And then down here also is that the work queue is the beginning of the process. So you can have all these work queues out here. It's important to have this box checked. And it defaults, the first one always defaults. But if you change your workflows around, you got to make sure sometimes if you have this box unchecked, then your workflow is never going to fire because it doesn't know which one's the first one in the queue. So this is the first event, and this is, again, this is a manual queue. So we have just the general information about the queue, then we get into assignments. Right? So you have different assignments where it's open. This is all access control. So an assignment, it's visible to all participants. That means anybody can terminate, reassign, or add participants. Shared, where all assignments are visible to all participants. Individual or supervised. We typically like to use supervised. And what we do is we put a rule behind it called directory roles. Because you don't ever want to assign a manual workflow task to a particular user. If people go on vacation, you have tasks that are sitting, nobody sees it, right? So the idea here is that within those directory roles, like Donna showed during the overview yesterday, you can assign a directory roles like this could be a traffic clerk or a front window clerk or however you want to define your roles, right? And then so if it's a supervised, these participants are supervisors and they can see all of these queues and they can reassign these queues if they need to. But here, in this configuration, like the way we have it set down is we have traffic team 1, traffic team 2, traffic team 3. So they have, how's that set up? Like the court girls are traffic team 1. They handle all the court processes. Then you have, what else do you have?
The office team.
Right, the office team that handle that 2, right? Yeah. So we break it down into 3 groups here. And it doesn't have to be teams. That's just the way we decided to do it. You can actually do it on a manual directory role and say, you know what, I want my accounting supervisors here, or I want, and my, I don't know, my bailiff as an example. Right? So it just depends on how your directory set up. And then you can actually do a conditional participation. So I only want to go to this, be assigned in this particular circumstance, and put a condition behind it.
Rich, can you tell them that if you assign somebody, they don't see the past ones?
That has changed.
Really?
Yes, so what happens is, and what she's referring to is when you assign somebody to this group, and you have these workflow tasks that are sitting out there, and let's say you have a new hire that comes in, and you put them in that directory role, they can't see the tasks that have already been assigned. Right, right. In 734, a feature was just released where it allows you to rebuild assignments. So you can go through and rebuild and...
Right. Where do I get that?
It's right here. It's called rebuild assignments. So as soon as we upgrade, the next upgrade you'll have it. Yeah. So you can rebuild these assignments and then...
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is there an ability to sort of assign a ability level to individuals? I'm thinking new staff coming on, I would be more selective in assigning challenges than just randomly from the whole collection of cases.
So, can you give me an example of that?
Well, in the phone system that is part of the work we do, we can assign inquiry clerks a low standard so that it's going to default to somebody else before it goes to them. Hopefully, while we don't screen for the difficulty of the incoming call, they are more likely to get phone messages than live calls. So is there any way to set sort of criteria as to who should get specific tasks?
You could do that if you're setting these up by you could. Here's the problem, right? You could actually assign these participants and then these 3 participants, and you can put a condition behind it that says in this circumstance, as long as the data element is tracked somewhere that determines, I want this type of case category to go to this group versus this case category to go to this group. Right? You could do that, right? And you could actually do that with these secondary roles. So let's say you have team 1 as an example, and then team 2, and you have a complex case and a non-complex case, right? So let's say all complex cases go to team 1, you would just set this queue up to do that. And then you'd have to, well, there's a couple ways to do it. You could do it this way, but then you could also build a, what we call a router queue. And so, so I could build this router queue that sits out here that says, here's my results. So here's my conditions. So team 1 assignment, and here's my condition. So if it's a complex case, let's just say, I don't know, event type is a trial. And then we can do a team 2 assignment where event type is, or event result is resets. Right? And then from there, you can boom, round them off into different manual queues. Right? So that's probably how I do it.
I think the trick is, for if you're new to workflow and these assignments, the trick is you can't, well, we saw if you were in Riley's demo, it doesn't read your mind yet, but it might someday.
Yeah.
But you got to put triggers in your data and flags so it knows, hey, I got a group of people I want to assign something. You have to set up your data that way so that the system knows, oh, with this case type, go over here with this. So when Chris is showing you this, you got to be thinking about how you're setting up your data,
Right.
so that it goes to the right gets routed. When there's decision trees, it has to know what to do with the data. So the data has to be divided out.
Right.
Is the concept.
It's in addition to our planning and, you know, because obviously I can't sort data if I haven't characterized it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it gets really, it can, and Carla can attest to this, I mean, it can easily get out of control, right? Because you start thinking about all the stuff that you can do, and it starts ballooning, and then in the confines, you know, I've built workflows where, honestly, because I've done 2 workflows and I wasn't thinking about the entire process, and I'm just like digging in and just building a workflow, all of a sudden, I'm in an endless loop, and it's generating 10,000 documents, and I can't get it to stop without restarting the system. You know, it's pretty crazy. Because if you look in here, just an example for their configuration, just in the process groups alone, for the court, you can see all of these. These are all automated and manual queues that are sitting in there.
One of them turns on a coffee pot, right?
Finally, you know, there was one point, you know, I was half serious because Carla was yelling at me one day, and finally I just turned around and I stepped back and I said, Carla, at some point your users really do need to enter data into the system. It's okay.
Can I ask a question? Now seeing the volume that you have, is there a feature that is available for one that's created, for example, you have FTA with a cash bond. Let's say I want a workflow for FTA surety bond that's tweaked just a little. Can I copy and create an existing workflow and tweak it and save it as a new workflow? Or do I have to start from scratch for the FTA with the surety bond?
So, yeah, well, the thing, let's see here.
Right, export it and import it.
Yeah, that's how you would do it. Here, you would actually take this work, you export it, and then you can re-import it and then tweak it from there.
Did you say there's a new work group?
They don't have save as right now in this work queue, right? So here's a process group. Yeah, we don't have that. Yeah, we don't have that yet. But again, you know, you take any of these workflow, like here's a surety bond exoneration. If I wanted to, I could just export this workflow and then re-import it and then tweak it from there.
So when I create a new, there's a feature that says select import, and I would then import this workflow and then tweak it and, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So if we go to this process group here, down here at the bottom, there's an import.
Awesome.
And we just import it and then.
Okay, great.
So you're in this loop that you're talking about. You know, the graph that you saw yesterday about the shared workflows and how it goes. Was your endless loop because of 2 workflows one workflow firing another workflow?
Yeah.
Sit on each other.
So is there a way to, like when you see your, I guess the graph itself, does it show it going to another workflow or it kicking off another workflow, just to try to prevent something from that?
Yeah, so in this monitor, it's this monitor, I'm sorry, not the monitor, the, go back to this. So in this graph that's set up, it's only in the context of failure period. Here's one as an example. So we have this graph utility. So as you're building your workflows,
Yeah.
you know, it builds this graph for you.
It doesn't show that it's firing another workflow.
It doesn't. If you were to do a sub-process group and call another workflow from there, it could, but differently, yeah, it doesn't. It's only in the context of this workflow process, this group, right? But all the workflows within that group, but yeah.
Okay.
So that's why we're recommending, like, you know, with you guys, going forward, and even when we did it with Placer, it's like, look, when we went down this path and went ahead, we worked on workflow, and you know, the world was our oyster. It was like we just hardly thought of new things every day, and we built, and it was very complex, and it caused us some pain in that area. Going forward, like with Placer, and you guys were like, you know what, pick 10 of your biggest pain points, and let's start with there. Right? Start with that. Let's get that down, and then you can build from there, because this could explode really
Yeah.
easy. Yes.
Is it when it, just like, I don't know how, I don't want to use the term baseline, but just kind of like a simple type of workflow that had been built, it's deployed in Gwinnett. Is it also available to Placer and the other installs, or is it they start from scratch?
Small
Yeah. Well, and the reason being that they start from scratch is because California and Georgia are significantly different in their workflow process.
But in theory, you could export.
You could
and
export
import
it
into a
into it.
different.
In theory.
Yeah, you
So
could.
you're exporting a package and you're importing it
You
into a
absolutely.
different instance.
Okay, and then they can tweak and modify how. Okay.
That's correct. Yep.
Give an air about
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, no.
Especially when you know the conditions.
Yeah.
And what state a
That's
condition
right.
has to be
Yep.
in order to trigger and to
Mhm.
step conclude or.
That's right. So in here, you know, going through this, here's the assignment. So we have our assignment rules sitting in here. These are the participants. You could actually, you know, we started down this path and we realized you can't really, you don't want to assign all your participants because people come and people go, and if you have a lot of workflows, it'd be really difficult to manage who's participating in these workflows from here. But you could theoretically assign a percentage of work to have it distribute if you wanted to. But we like to keep it simple. I like to assign it to a group of people and then make certain people supervisors. Then we go over to our screens, and these are different screens. So we have navigation rules within the system that allow you to navigate to a particular area in the system. So here, this opens the case and the case summary screen. So when we were looking at these workflows, when we were looking at What do I do? I think David's demoing the system.
So what's that icon or button that you're selecting?
So this icon that we're selecting up here at the top is, this is the workflow,
Okay,
the
okay.
workflow button for that case, and for some reason,
Oh, there are your tools that just finally drop down. It says-
something just, yeah, something just majorly broke.
Flux capacitor.
Yeah, the flux capacitor did die. Yeah, so it looks like the workflow just completely crashed, so, I don't know. So, yeah, awesome.
Got it, what information?
So let me, actually, I think we're okay.
Does this happen a lot? That's good.
It,
Oh, it is.
actually, this is the first time that ever happened, and I suspect that, I don't mean to blame it on David, but he's out there doing a demo, and I don't know.
Just reboot the server.
Just reboot the server. So we'll hop over to another environment.
When was the demo thing brought in? Is it going to be a cross version issue?
So what's that?
Like, did you just export, I don't know, I guess one version of our production and bring it over? Could there be a compatibility issue between the two?
Yeah, so that has been an issue. We want to make sure that when we're moving stuff from one place to another, that you're on the same versions of
Gotcha.
eCourt. Because it'll, yeah. Okay, so we're back to core process group here. We're actually in another environment. So this is Marietta. Yeah. So here we go, like I said, we have a failure to appear cache bond in this manual queue. So you can define screens that you have in the system. And so you saw that OC earlier in here. So if you go to failure to appear, see this OC, this is a screen, so if I select that, it's going to open the case. Right? So that's just this navigation rule that's defined. And you can have more than one screen defined. So if you wanted to go to the documents viewer, or you want to go to a specific add form or an update form, you can define it. Results, this is pretty important. So here, what do you want to happen in this particular circumstance? So you have the code. So if we open this, we want to generate the warrant. We give it a name, and then we give it an action. So what are we going to do with this, right? So this allows you to pick any of these workflows that are already predefined. Or you could say, you know what, I want to build a new manual queue or a new router queue or a new So if I wanted this to go to a brand new queue, I can select that and it'll create my queue automatically for me, and I just could go in and name it. It's all connected. But this is important because this tells you what it is and where we're sending it to. So here, if it's a G code, we're going to send it to generate warrant, which is this one. If it's this grace period, we're going to send it to the FTA grace period queue, which is down here, this add FTA grace period. Or we can disregard it and completely end the event. All right. So again, that is from here, the results. So you're building your results and telling it where to go. And then you can assign deadlines to it. So if if it's failure to complete, you can say, give me a warning. Or you can say within, if this timestamp expires within 3 days, what do you want it to do? So in this example, if you have something that's sitting out there waiting and that deadline passes, you can automatically assign it to a supervisor queue if you want to. And then here, the last thing we'll talk about in the purposes of this is autocomplete. These are pretty important. So as you have manual queues that are sitting out there, you don't want those manual queues just to sit out there and rot forever. You want them to go away when something happens. So in this particular circumstance, we have a failure to appear with a cache bond. Let's say somebody comes in and issues a warrant manually. We want that queue to go away because there's a warrant then that's been issued in the case, right? So it auto completes that queue. From any of these, so here's a manual queue from any of these, I can expand it and see where it's going to. So I can see that here it's a generate warrant, failure to appear grace period. I can expand the generate warrant, and I can start seeing where it's going to, right, just by expanding this here. So here it's going to generate warrant, and you notice the icon looks a little bit different here. So if we look at the generate warrant queue right here, we can see that this is generate warrant. We see that it's an auto queue. And auto queues fire business rules. So if we go over here to the tab, here's the business rule that's been fired. And this is the add warrant rule. And so if we expand this, we're presented with this little box. And here's all of the business rules that are available to us to fire within the system. And so we have a big, huge, growing library of business rules that we've used across clients across states. So those that are developed in Placer and used in Gwinnett and vice versa, because they're all pretty similar. Maybe a little bit tweaks here and there, but all those business rules are always typically added to the system and available.
Would you say maybe like 100, 200?
Yeah, I mean, these are all business rules.
Do they get pushed out as a baseline, Chris? Or?
Not as a baseline, but as we're doing the configuration, like as an example, a lot of when we were doing your configuration, a lot of the rules that we had originally used in Gwinnett, we just ported them over as part of the
But if a client wanted to go build some workflows or rules, how would we know where your library is and how to be able to grab those?
The thing is, right now we don't have a standard library that's pushed out that's productized because this is configured. This is considered configuration. So in that circumstance, I would say if you would say, you know what, I'm building a business rule, you could just open a ticket and just say, hey, we want to build this business rule. Do you guys have this? Give an example of this. And that, for now, I'll cover it that way. Yeah.
Can you export that list just to have it exported just so you have names?
Yeah. So here, here if you select this icon here, it takes us into our business rule engine, and it'll show you how this business rule is written. It'll take a second to load up. But we have a business rule engine in here that allows you to build these. And then from within the business rule engine itself, I'll open this in a new tab. Here's our index of rules, and then you can flag the ones that you want and actually export those rules if you wanted to. Also, yeah, so here's the, so this is the example of the business rule that's written in Ruby to add the warrant automatically when you select that option. So we know that the input on this is a case, and then we're defining, the business rule actually defines these parameters down here. So we have the case, the warrant type, and the warrant status, which shows up when you pick this business rule. So if I wanted a warrant type of a violation of probation, I can just check it.
I see you also defined if it was mandatory or required.
That's correct. So that's within the confines of the business rule here, whether it's required or. And so, here we go, warrant type that's required, and then our lookup item, so it knows where to look for. And then what do we want to do? So, what happens when this business rule fires? Well, the next thing we want it to do is we want it to send it somewhere else. So here we are, we're going to add a warrant document. So now we go down here to add a warrant document. There's another business rule. Add document. And then from here it goes to the manual queue that's activate bail or forfeit bail. And so here's another manual queue. So within here, we activate this bench warrant, and the results are activate the warrant. We can update it, just goes through, and the bench warrant is activated. So we change and fire this business rule, and we're just simply updating the status of this warrant record. So you can begin to see that as long as you have these library of business rules that are available to you, you don't really need, it always helps to understand how to write business rules, but you don't need to build workflow, right? You can start putting these together. The other thing that I like to do when I'm building these workflows is if I have a series, because I'm not a programmer, and when I write business rules, I could write basic business rules, but it becomes very dangerous very quickly. What I like to do is put together my workflow. So I'll go ahead and put all of these things in here, and then I'll reach out to a guy like this and say, hey, I need a business rule with this input here, I need a business rule with this input here. So I can give him the workflow, and then he can actually just plug in the rules where it's needed, because this infrastructure is already
So
sitting out here.
you're kind of building the foundation and then the shell, if you will, because I would assume you probably have to make sure you're in the right order, and then because you've got dependencies
Yep.
on rules.
That's
So
Well, and yeah, most importantly, like inputs, right? You gotta understand what the input is when you're building a business rule, right? Is your input a scheduled event, or is it a case, or is it, you gotta understand that, right? You gotta understand the context in which it's being fired in. Yeah. Yeah. But, in fact, I did a lot of these Gwinnett workflows that way. If I could build a workflow, if I could build a business rule, I would build a workflow and then reach out and say, I just need these, this is what I need, right? So it,
If you drop a dummy rule in there, or you do that blank.
no, you can leave it blank, right? Which is also very dangerous, right? One of the other things that gets you is you could leave this blank. So I built workflows before and thought that I put the business rule in, and I can't figure out why things aren't working. Well, because it's blank, there's no business rule in there. Or the worst gets you is that you can actually assign multiple business rules in the context of workflow.
How do you test your business rule?
So I go through to the use case, like I just create the case and then test it from beginning to end.
Okay, so you do that with this, yeah, use case. Okay.
One of the things that we have here, this is the problem, right? So we have this workflow monitor that sits out here, which is great. This tool is amazing. So, you know, you sit out here and for this week and for, let's see, for the last 12 months, I can see all the workflows that are fired in the system. And I can put in a case ID, so I can say, show me everything that's fired in this case. Well, I remember in Gwinnett, I spent 4 or 5 hours one day working a help desk ticket. Problem was, something was happening and I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I'm looking in the context of this workflow monitor, which gives you the context of this workflow. It doesn't tell you every business rule that fired, it just tells you that this workflow kicked off, right? So I'm going through this and I'm going through this, and I'm like, why is it doing this? It's only showing that this workflow is firing once, but it's doing this and this and this and this. Well, when I went back here and looked, in this definition, I had a bunch of business rules defined in here. So it was in the context of this one workflow, it was firing this business rule, this business rule, this business rule, this business rule. So it took me a while and I found it and I'm like, wow. So what I like to do when I'm building workflows is that it's one business rule per workflow. And then send it to another one, send it to another one, send it to another one. That way when you're troubleshooting it, you have the context of which it's fired in.
That actually mirrors your flow chart. Because every single action is individual in the flow chart.
That's right.
It's not if-thens and if-thens and if-thens.
Right. And the other thing is you got to really pay attention to your results, right? Because, you know, and I've done this not only in the situation that I described with the other workflow, but within the confines of this workflow here, if I sent it back to, if I sent this one, which is add the warrant, and then I inadvertently checked generate warrant, generate the warrant, add the document, generate the warrant, add the document, and I put it in an endless loop. It would just go and go and go until, and the only way to stop it is to restart the system. So, yeah. So it's always good to try to keep your workflows smaller, right? It's better to have more process groups or more, you know, than it is to have one giant workflow that covers everything, because it can get really rough. So we utilize workflow for a whole number of things. We fire interfaces off of workflows. So here's an example of the Department of Driver Services interface in Georgia, where we're adding sending a DDS record on a charge update, the disposition that's reportable by attributes, and then we add the DDS conviction. And then here's an example of, let's see, the DDS kit response files, and I think this is, yeah, so it's a timer trigger. So here's an example of a timer trigger. So every day at this time we want it to run and go process these files. So we utilize workflow for interfaces a lot. So anything that you really want done manually in the system with business rules, business rules can be fired on, I didn't know where of this, but business rules can be fired on entities. So if we look at entities in the system, let's say I look at case, I can go to my rules, and so if it's an insert of a case entity, we want it to fire this business rule. And we can put them on forms. So any add and update form in the system, we can fire business rules. Which is okay, and we're starting to get a little bit back to that. I've always been a big fan of putting business rules within workflow, and one of the reasons happens to be with this monitor. Because here, if a business rule fails or something happens with that, it'll actually let you know that. So here's an example of a failure to appear with an arraignment. This is a suspended workflow. So something didn't happen right. So business rule or something failed on this workflow. So I know something happened. In the context of a business rule that may not be working in a form or an entity, you may not get that.
So when you have something like this, and it, like let's say you have 10 work queues and on the 5th one it fails, how do you pick up from that 5th one? Would you start the workflow over?
You would then treat it probably as one line item for like something within this file failed type of thing, or would it be unique?
Well,
If I had a file,
it's in the context of as an example, if we're running a business rule that is, I don't know, building a file for an interface.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The whole thing.
It would be transactional too, so it would roll back, you wouldn't have partial, and then it would start fresh at that step again.
So here, and you could also terminate and continue, so if you wanted to, you could bypass it and then go on back, we'll go through the rest of the workflow. So, that's why I've always been a big fan. I know there's pros and cons to putting business rules on, forms and entities versus, putting them in workflow. I've always been a big fan of workflow because it suspends it and you can retry it, and you don't have that control when you're doing it in an entity rule.
It's not hard coded. It's not code. If something changes, I think I saw if something changes, these workflows have an end date.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's no longer applicable, and if I needed to create a new,
That's correct.
It's got an associated effective date range.
That's correct. It does. So it has a date range within the workflows. So if we go here, here's my case import. Here's a case import. So here's not only is it valid from and to, but then we can activate and inactivate. Here's an example, right? This is an example of. So the eCourt config that we saw a few minutes ago, right, was a baseline for this config that I'm working on right now for Marietta Municipal Court in Georgia. So what we did is we started with all of these 22 processes that are sitting out there. We went through all of these workflows and we said, how does your process differ? So when we went through that, you could see that there's a whole bunch of these workflows out here that are grayed out, because these workflows weren't applicable to Marietta.
Inactive.
Mm-hmm. So we just, instead of deleting them, we want them there, we just made them inactive. They're sitting out there, right? And then from there, once we said, okay, this doesn't work, then I can say, you know what? Let's look at their arraignment. Let's see. Or failure to appear arraignment. Wow. Their failure to appear arraignment looks a lot different than in Gwinnett's, because what they do is they add a failure to appear charge, then we do a case assessment, then we generate a bench warrant letter, and then, because what happens is, in the example, the difference is that Gwinnett Records Court, they go to warrant on everything. In Marietta, their payer appear cases, they don't go to warrant, they just issue what they call an FTA or DPS 912 to DMV, that's it, boom, done. So we were able to take these workflows and then just tweak them. So, and I was actually able to do that and take their workflows that we did and theirs and have meeting. What, Pam, we met 3 days? 3 or 4 days. I came back, it took me a week to modify their workflows. And
yeah, it was really quick and simple. I mean, it was, the groundwork was there, and it was just, like Chris said, a few minor tweaks, and we were ready to go.
yeah. So, And again, so these are all these ones that aren't being used are sitting out there engraved. They're still there and available if we ever needed them. If I wanted to go back and figure out, hey, what do we do here? Right. Yeah. So this really is, I mean, when you start getting into the configurability of the system, you start looking at workflow. Workflow is a great thing, but I know like workflow makes a guy like Kyle cringe. Because what happens is, and Carla can attest to this, is you start thinking about these processes, right? You go, wow, I can do this, now I can do this, and I can do this. I swear that woman right there has a whiteboard by her bed. Because she's constantly coming at us with, I want to do this and I want to do this. And it can just
worry about the exceptions. I would worry about the exceptions. This is the normal process, but what happens like this over here? You go. That's why manual queues are good.
Yeah.
You gotta have some manual queues.
Manual queues, right.
Somebody's
So
got to
you
look
make
at
that
it.
determination.
Like as an
Yeah, you
example,
make the
right?
determination.
Like as an example, one of the rules of thumb that I do when I'm implementing something, if it has to do with a financial,
Oh, absolutely.
we can create an invoice, that's fine. I'll create an invoice, and even in certain circumstances, we'll rescind an invoice. But in that, here's an example. I have a rule out here, a workflow, that allows you to modify a sentence. So let's say somebody's been issued a fine in the amount of $500. At some point, that fine is modified and reduced to $250. Right? How do you do that? You have an invoice for $500 sitting out there. How do you do that? Right? So what we do is we go ahead and we can modify that sentence or add a brand new sentence record, and we have a status that says regenerate invoice. So it goes out, it looks, there's a router queue that says, hey, has a payment been taken on this case? If a payment's been taken on this case, send it to a manual queue that says this sentence been modified. You have to move the money around. If not, okay, go ahead and resend the invoice and create a brand new invoice.
If nothing's happened, it doesn't matter.
Right. Right.
So it does handle those exceptions.
That's router queues are hugely important for that. Another example, let's say you have a cash bond that's sitting out there. Case has been exonerated, right? My general rule of thumb is we do not move money around automatically via transfers. That's got to go to a person. So boom, manual queue. If there's a cash bail on the case and it needs to be transferred, send it to a manual queue and let them transfer it. So router queues are definitely your friend. They're, right, and again, let's see. Let me see if I can find an example of, yeah, here we go. So here's an example of a router queue. So we have a bond forfeiture process here, right? So we have a scheduled event update, and it's an order to show cause with an event result of forfeited as final or forfeited not as final. Right? So it's a simple condition. Well, the first queue is we want to determine what the forfeiture type is. So if it's a bail forfeiture not as disposition, we want to add this status. Otherwise, add this final status. So this is just a router queue. It's just really an if-then. So we can go in here and say otherwise, or we can put another condition on it. Right? So if this or otherwise. Right? We can do that with notices. So as an example, you know what? Here's a router queue. In this circumstance, we want it to generate this notice. In this circumstance, we want it to generate this notice. I have one set up in Gwinnett where we have one judge that insisted on having a document in his courtroom that was different from everybody else. So the other two courtrooms have one document. This judge wanted a document printed out for his courtroom, so I used a router queue that says, this assigned judge, generate this document for him. Right? You got to be careful with that because again, it's like holy cow, you can see how that can mushroom, right? So, but yeah, router queues. It's just basically.
Is there a limit to the number of router queues you can have per?
No, not that I'm aware.
Would the router queue also be used for, especially with the going back to the interfaces? Because if there's a data element that's missing that the receiving agency would be expecting, for example, DMV is requiring a date of birth.
Yep.
And for some reason that record didn't contain the date of birth, then it would be routed to a manual queue to
Yep.
then be managed and.
As an example, let's see. I'll show you that exact thing here. So we're back in the California config. So here, let's see. Let's see if I can find it. Oops.
You hired from
Let's see if I can find this real quick here. Here's an example of that. So we have a router queue that, so we're getting a return file back from DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles. We want to determine what type of error it is, right? So if the case type is juvenile traffic, send it to this queue, otherwise send it to this queue. We have the same type of thing where in California, in order to send the transaction in the first place, you got to have a driver's license. If you don't have a driver's license, you need to have a date of birth and an address, right? So it checks that. So the first thing it does is checks to see if it's a valid DMV file before it even tries to send it. It's a no pass go, so it just sends it to a queue. It checks that, routes it back to a queue, and then you can correct it before it gets sent.
And when you say queue, that would be like a designated user or?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about a queue, it could be a manual queue, but I'm talking about like a manual queue.
Manual queue, okay.
Yep. So here's an example. These are manual queues. Find that. Oh yeah. So the first thing we do is, so it's a case disposition insert with no previous send to DMV. The first thing we're going to do is check to see if the data is valid. Right? If it's ready for DMV, otherwise send the DMV exception. Right? And then there's that DMV exception conviction router key that sits out there. So yeah, you don't have enough information here. So fix it before you even try to send it.
Also, no hard code.
That's right. No hard coding. Yeah. So, and I think these, for any of those that you attended the business rule stuff, you see that really within eCourt, Kaushik talked about this yesterday, it's really is a framework, right? So you could pretty much do anything in this application with business rules. I don't think we've come across anything that we have not been able to do in using business rules.
You send emails.
What's that?
You send our emails. The releases from the bond company. By this.
We could probably actually turn on the coffee pot.
Nice.
We could, if it was networked correctly, we could do that. Yeah.
So what about receiving email? Like for our OBTS, we have to send it off to the FTP server, and the response comes back as an email. It doesn't come back in the FTP server. It's like, I mean, I know there's a way to do it through VBA on this stuff, but checking or monitoring an inbox on the Exchange server.
Right. That'd be really.
We could do that through business.
You guys are using this.
Why couldn't you do that, right? You could do that.
Yeah. This is where the project manager meeting sets up and says, yes, you
Yes,
could.
you could, but.
You wouldn't want to because you'll never go live.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that we do in here, like Carla was referring to, is that, yeah, we can even generate a document and send emails. So, the surety bond exoneration notices, they all automatically go out by email. Just
No
send them.
postage, nothing.
Yep. So
Oh, and you get a red
business rules
receipt. You get
Yeah.
receipts too, that they got.
Yeah.
You can monitor a file folder, so you can always have an exchange, have a rule that goes, if the email comes from this particular person with this address, that or the
Yep.
email has
Pull it
a
in.
dot text file for this folder, it would monitor the folder and pick it up.
Yeah.
cool thing is we're all talking about what can it do and how do we do it. There's dozens of ways you can accomplish the same
That's the other thing.
functionality. So like Chris might have one solution, Pete might have another solution, and it's just a matter of what you've experienced within, configuration and what your knowledge is, and that's going to grow over time. That's why, Chris has done so many workflows with Gwinnett. His knowledge base is, large. So as you get that knowledge, you can apply it in different ways and get really creative with how you implement things.
Right. That's the thing, right? I think that makes these two guys maybe feel a little bit more comfortable, because I'm now the firm believer that just, pick your 10 pain points, your 5 or 10 biggest pain points. Let's deal with those, because the system will grow. You can do that stuff later on, right? Let's, get your whiteboard later on, but let's deal with those 10 things so you can go live, get you up on the system, get you running, and then, and learn and build it.
That's why this class is so hugely important as well, because you want Greg and Robert, you want to know how to do this.
Right.
For that very reason. You can grow this thing for years and years and years and years and years.
Never ending.
And if you're waiting on your project team from us to do it, you're never gonna be ready. You're never gonna go live. But we pick your 10, we'll get you up and running, and you've got the skill set to build it for years to come. Then every time Carla thinks of something, she just has to call Chris. She calls you two guys.
We talk about, and I'm going to do that.
If she helps you, contact me.
I'm actually going to do the Recorder's Court case study tomorrow morning. But, when we're talking about that, and I'll just say this. We had a project in California that was really never ending, and I never thought was going to end, ever.
I'm in the room, Chris, come on.
It wasn't you, Greg.
It was the other California project.
And, you can see the number of workflows, even bigger than what Gwinnett had, and it just mushroomed, and there was no scope, and we just could not get, they finally did go live, but
But they weren't happy, right?
They weren't happy.
They got 10,000 workflows. They don't even have to go to work in the morning, they just punch a button, right? They're not happy because it took too long.
Does everything for you. If you do, then they probably don't need you.
Right.
Start selling.
Are you guys e-filing in your court too? Oh, man.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
That's a whole.
Tulare is actually, they just signed off on the portal, so they're going live this week with e-filing in California.
Well, they're gonna go live with the public, the 1st of October. They're gonna have one attorney test it out for a couple of weeks till the end of the month. So then open it up,
So, and it's really bad. I learned my lesson the hard way, because so this court right here, just in Sonoma, California, this was the first time that I ever did workflow. And being in the justice division world all these years, we had to do all this stuff manually, and I really, I caught the bug. I'm like, wow, we can monitor, we can just do so much here. And, I know that Donna was the same way. It's like, we just let's do this. This is really cool stuff, but it just, yeah. So we just, going forward, you step back and say, look, just pick those pain points, and let's, and then you can build from there. Because even then, I'm actually amazed, even with Gwinnett, how few problems we did have with workflow, because it was so.
But we
There's
tested
so
it
much.
really.
Tested a lot. Testing is so critical, especially when you get workflow this big, because there's so many dependencies and so many things that are happening. It gets pretty crazy pretty quick.
and we're just discussing things.
And you're just like, yeah, you haven't even got to really play with it yet.
But I'm telling you, it's been amazing by what we've seen. From the time we signed the contract, with conversions and everything, we're looking at what? Less than 9 months?
Yeah, probably.
To go live. With the previous system that we were trying to go with, we tried for 4.5, almost 5 years to go live.
Sorry.
And we just
Couldn't initiate a case, right?
Yeah, couldn't initiate a case. That was the biggest problem. Couldn't even get in the door. So.
So it's been, it's been pretty cool. eCourt, we've seen it grow, we've seen it expand, and one of the coolest things, and this is why I love working in this product, is this right here, this workflow. I just love it. It's so many things you can do. People come to you with a problem and you can solve it. It's like, we got this problem, how can we solve it? Well, between workflow and business rules and time standards, I don't think we've come across anything that we haven't been able to solve. Now, you gotta make good decisions, right? Sometimes it's not worth doing it, clearly.
One of the most important things that we personally found with the workflows and the manual queues is nothing's going to slip through the cracks, because it's going to be sitting there, and then, as a supervisor, she can look at her employees and go, oh, they're not doing what they need to be doing because these are still sitting in the workflow.
Will you definitely assign it to queue?
Here?
The dates and the time when they turn red and when it has to be completed by the
Oh,
due
it's
date.
down here, yeah.
Mine turn red. Do you have yours coded?
Well, they do, they're just done, there's nothing in it, that's default, so.
But how do you know who it's assigned to?
You can click on it.
Yeah, you can actually,
I open up the queue, yeah.
click on these and you can see who
Oh,
it's,
there you go.
who's
And
assigned
it
to.
says, yeah.
Go back on the screen, Chris. I saw you have what arrow where it says assigned to myself, and you got options right there by myself up at the top.
Oh, yeah.
Assigned to
Yeah, so these are work queues that are assigned, these are work queues that are assigned to myself,
myself, but you
or I can see any of the work queues if I have rights to see.
And then go down to the bottom, the ones that don't have any, you can see those also.
Right.
See down the check mark at the very bottom?
Hide the work queues with
Yeah,
no outstanding
uncheck
tasks.
that.
And,
I assume down the admins will look at everything.
Yeah.
Other
And they'll
people
look at
log in, they'll just see the queues that they need.
Right. Right, and so here, and again, the reason that, like, even if I go to myself, the reason is because as an administrator, I'm assigned to every.
But I open that every morning, I can see who's doing their job or what
Right.
he's doing about it.
That's
Yeah.
going to be one of the most valuable things for me as
Agreed.
managing people is, every morning, that's the first thing I'm going to do is say, hey, where are we?
And your people love it, huh?
No.
Well,
Well,
do you ask for the extra now?
But here's the thing, here's the thing. And we'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow, but one of the things, and I didn't really even realize this until, I don't know, 6 months after go live, 6, 8 months after go live even. I walked in the office one day and Carla says, you know what, come here, I want to show you something. She takes me down into the office, and I look, and she goes, look at these desks. When I first got there, there were desks, there were papers piled on
They
these
didn't know
desks.
what to do. They didn't know where to start.
It was, now their desks are completely clean. These girls, they come in every day and they work their queues.
Right.
They have a task list of stuff that they get to do, and this is it.
And
it's-
they know we can see it.
Yeah, it just changed the whole dynamic of the office. It's incredible, and so they can deal with, 120,000 traffic tickets a year with this full-time staff of 14 people. It's pretty amazing what this can do for you. So, again, as you're thinking about that, and I know some of you, I think in the room, you really want to learn more about workflow and start building your workflow processes up, but just be thinking about those, 5 or 10 big pain points and start with that area. And you can use these different tools that are sitting out here, like Visio or whatever it is for you, and just start documenting your processes. What it looks like for you. You can take that and anybody have any other questions, comments? It's kind of a down and dirty, but just an overview of workflow that you. All right. Thank you for your time.
Good job, Chris.